Mangiarotti, Paris, July 1960, as the TV reporters say. I was 20 years old and I was starving to death. I hadn't eaten anything for 2 days except for half a cheese sandwich that I found in the lining of my coat. I remember eating the first half in late May of the same year. It had taken me a week to hitchhike to Paris from Italy, and my money had run out. Before I left Milan, my friend Silvano had told me that he knew a man in Paris who might be able to give me a job. The man's name was Mangiarotti. He didn't seem to have a first name, and he was a painter. Mangiarotti worked somewhere in the 14th arrondissement, the Porte de Vanves area of Paris. Now, to say that you are a painter in Paris sounds quite romantic, so perhaps I should add that he was not an artist, but a house painter. According to Silvano, Mangiarotti specialized in painting shop fronts. Anyway, as soon as I arrived in Paris, I spent my last few centimes on a metro ride to Plaisance, which seemed to be right in the middle of the 14th arrondissement, and started to wander through the streets, searching for anyone who looked like an Italian house painter. I searched high and low, tramping along main streets, peering down side streets, asking passers-by, poking my head into every baker's and greengrocer's and fishmonger's as I went, but in vain. No sign of Mangiarotti. By the end of the first day, I was so desperate that I sold my watch to a second-hand dealer. Funny how my expensive Timex was suddenly worth little more than the price of an omelette and chips. That night I slept on a hard bench in the local park. I woke next morning stiff and cold and as hungry as ever. I'd better get up and start looking for Mangiarotti, I thought. Mangiarotti? I didn't even know what he looked like, for goodness sake. I imagined a short, dark-haired, sun-tanned man. In other words, the typical Englishman's idea of the typical Italian. But what if he were tall, red-haired and fair-skinned? I had seen Italians from the Alto Adige who looked like that. Talk about looking for a needle in a haystack. All the same, there was nothing for it but to continue the search. Finally, towards the end of the afternoon, when my feet ached and my shoulder hurt from the weight of my bag and my empty stomach groaned with hunger, my luck changed. I happened to look down a side street and saw, to my delight, a man up a ladder, paintbrush in hand. As I approached, I saw that he was short, dark-haired and sun-tanned, the typical Englishman's idea of the typical Italian. Moreover, he was painting the front of a shop. I called up to him. "Scusi, signore, excuse me," I said in my best Italian. "Are you Mr. Mangiarotti?" He came down the ladder and eyed me silently while he wiped the paint from his brush with an old rag. His stare made me feel uncomfortable, for it seemed to go straight through me. He continued to look me up and down without speaking. I felt stupid, so I went on, "I am a friend of Silvano Agosto, and he told me that." My words trailed off into silence as he turned away from me to put his paintbrush down. Then he turned to face me again. I repeated my original question, "Are you Mr. Mangiarotti?" He shrugged his shoulders as if to say that it didn't matter whether he was or not. Suddenly he addressed me in French. "Allons boire un coup. Let's go and have something to drink." I followed him into a nearby cafe, where he ordered a glass of a colourless liquid that turned milky when he added water to it. I asked if I could have a white coffee, thinking to myself that the milk in it might do something to satisfy my hunger. "Allora, sei un amico di Silvano. So you're a friend of Silvano," he said, switching to Italian without warning. I nodded. "Alors, qu'est-ce que tu fais ici?" "So, what are you doing here?" he asked, switching back to French. Why on earth did he keep changing from one language to the other? Was he showing off? Was he making fun of me? Was he just testing me? I felt very confused and uncertain, the way I used to feel in front of a particularly difficult teacher when I was at school. I started to mumble a reply in French, a language that I was not very good at. I explained, as best as I could, that I had been working in Milan, but had decided to spend the summer in Paris, providing, that is, that I could find work. "Why are you speaking to me in French?" he asked, interrupting me. Then, before I could reply, he roared with laughter. He found the joke, whatever it was, very funny. Suspecting that he was laughing at me, I began to feel more and more irritated. His laughter ceased as suddenly as it had begun. "Well now, my young friend," he said, addressing me this time in fluent English, "you are a friend of Silvano Agosto. You are looking for a Mr. Mangiarotti, and you want a job, hmm?" Seeing the look of astonishment on my face at being addressed in English, he added, "You do speak English, don't you?" "Of course, I do," I replied angrily. "I am English." "I would never have guessed," he said, and once again burst out laughing. There was an unmistakable tone of irony in his voice. "How did you know I was English?" I asked, my face still showing anger. "Oh, come on, my young English friend. Don't look so upset. I was only pulling your leg. It is not so difficult to guess your nationality." "How?" I asked. At the tender age of 20, I like to think of myself as a citizen of the world, not a typical product of my native country. "Well, first of all, you are tall and fair-haired. How many Italians are tall and fair? Next, you have a pale complexion, even though you have been living in Italy, the land of sunshine. And your hairstyle, forgive me, I do not mean to be rude, could only be English." My hair was wavy, long, falling across my forehead, and I had a parting on the left. Was this so typically English? Perhaps he was right. "As for your shoes—" He did not finish the sentence. I looked down at my feet. Nothing wrong with them, I thought, but on the other hand, perhaps they were rather traditional in no design. "Finally, my young friend, there is the matter of your Italian. You speak it fluently and quite accurately, it is true, but your accent, only an Englishman could pronounce my name the way you do. Mangiarotti. Ugh, you make it sound like the name of a fat old horse." Despite the rather uncomplimentary things he had said about my appearance and my Italian accent, I couldn't help admiring the way he had worked out my nationality from the various clues. Just like the famous detective Sherlock Holmes, who could tell from the slightest clue, a cigarette end perhaps, that the man who had been smoking it was a short left-handed Turkish watchmaker with a bad cold. Anyway, the upshot was that Mangiarotti gave me a job, and I settled down in Paris. About 2 weeks after I had started working for him, I used a few francs to telephone Silvano. After all, it was thanks to Silvano that I had a job in Paris, and I wanted him to know that everything had turned out well. "Hello, Silvano. It's me. Joe, I'm phoning from Paris. Before I could say another word, Silvano interrupted in his usual enthusiastic manner and took over the conversation. "Hi, Joe. How are you? Everything okay? So you got to Paris after all, eh? Good for you. Oh, that reminds me, Joe. You remember I told you about an Italian that I knew in Paris, a guy called Mangiarotti. Well, I phoned him the day you left Milan. I described you to him in detail in case you tried to get in touch with him. So he's sort of half expecting you, Joe. Why don't you see if you can find him? Or perhaps you have already found him." Oh yes, I had found him all right, Mr. Clever Sherlock Holmes Mangiarotti.